I'm not the exception to the rule. It's going to work because it's worked for so many. And why would I let ego actually have me believe that I'm the exception to this rule? I'm the different one. That's so important in recovery is, work the processes, work the program, work whatever you're doing. Consistently, results will come.
It's time for the Share Recovery Podcast, where we bring you amazing life-changing success stories from addicts and alcoholics all over the world who share their inspiring journey in recovery. And now, here's your host, O.
Today, we have Warren Broad joining us on the Share Podcast, the creator of the Recovery in the Now program. He's a therapist, a counselor, and a coach. Join us now as Warren takes us through 15 years of drug abuse and his inspiring journey into recovery up until today. It's a wonderful story. You don't want to miss this episode. But first, a message from our sponsor. Sober Nation is the largest online recovery community and treatment resource center. They provide treatment resources to those struggling with addiction, as well as to the family members who are caught in the crossfire. On top of that, Sober Nation is a huge community of good people who share their experience with each other. They have informative content, recovery and addiction news, as well as an entire clothing line which helps expand the culture of recovery. They can easily be found at www.sobernation.com. Sober Nation is putting recovery on the map. And if you're looking for more than just one recovery-related podcast, I've got two for you. The Recovery Elevator and That Sober Guy. On Mondays, you have Paul Churchill with the Recovery Elevator podcast. On Tuesdays, you have me, O, with the Share podcast. And on Fridays, you have Shane Raymer with the That Sober Guy podcast. Tune in every week and add us to your recovery portfolio. HP, baby. And after this interview, if you enjoyed listening to the Share podcast, please leave us a rating and review on iTunes or Stitcher Radio. This will ensure we get ranked well on these networks, and that means more people will easily find the Share podcast. This is the best way to show your support and help us grow. You can also find the Share podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube. Go to any one of your favorite social networks, and the Share podcast will come right up. And finally, if you would like to make a donation to the Share podcast, you can do so using PayPal. On the top right corner of the website, you'll see a donate button. Just click on it, and this will take you to the page where you can make your donation. Thanks again for helping the Share podcast become a huge success. Now back to the show. Hey, Warren, thanks for joining us.
Hey, great to be here.
Excellent. How you feeling today?
Oh, feeling awesome. Thank you.
I love it. All right, let's get started. So, folks, today we have Warren Broad joining us on the Share podcast, the creator of the Recovery in the Now program. He's a therapist, a counselor, and a coach. So, Warren, let's dive right in. Tell us about how your life is today, your hobbies, exercise routine. Take us into your normal daily routine, including recovery, and also tell us about your Recovery Now program.
Sure. Well, in day-to-day life, exercise is absolutely a big part of recovery for me. I am constantly working towards some kind of goal. And this time, my hope is that come the spring, I'm in Canada, so we get a fair amount of snow where I am in the winter, so I'll be sort of doing indoor and outdoor training. I'm hoping to complete my first marathon, possibly late spring, which will probably be either May or June of next year. So one of the big things in recovery for me is that I'm always working towards a goal. Without a goal, I'm often kind of floundering. So I've got a running program that I'm following and trying to do my best to adhere to that, which does all sorts of great things. It keeps me on a trajectory towards a goal. And I'm a firm believer in the benefits of cardio and what that does for mindset in recovery. Even in my earliest days, after the first time I went through treatment, swimming was a massive aid to me in really my first 60 days, where I swam almost every day. And it was just part of that process of not being bored, not having idle hands while I was in some of those early stages of recovery quite a long time ago. So day-to-day life is at this point a combination of working with my clients. I work with clients in person, and I also work with clients virtually, either like we're doing on Skype or over the phone. And there's a real sort of combination between my in-person clientele and my long-distance clientele. And generally with the training schedule that I'm on, being an addict, I like to do things to the extreme. And if I'm not careful, I have to take days off. I have to make sure that I would run every day if I could, but I would injure myself, and I already have once. So I have to be very careful about making sure I do take my days off. It's a combination between my family life, my work life, and my exercise.
Excellent. Yeah, I tell you, I just started swimming recently, and I love it. It helps kind of lengthen out the muscles. And, I go to the gym, and, I used to be like this psychopath about going to the gym and being in shape. And it took a lot of time. So I can jump into that addict mode and just disconnect from everything else, focus on this one area of my life, right? And then watch other areas just kind of, lose its balance. So, yeah.
Absolutely. That's really well said. It's one of the things that I've noticed many, many times, not just in my own life, but with almost all of my clients, is that they get into a month or 2 months of recovery, and now they want to do a triathlon. And it's like, okay, let's talk about balance here. Let's talk about where the addict behavior is showing up and just, transferring to a new area. And it's so funny because triathlon is almost always the thing that I hear is like, it's not even just marathon. Marathon alone is a huge undertaking, but now I want to do a marathon and swim and bike. It's always kind of humorous. That's usually when I have to let them know, can we just dial that back just a little bit?
I'll tell you what, the last one I heard was, I'm doing an Ironman. So it's like, okay, all right, man. How about you just do a 10K? Let's start there and see if you can finish that one. Fortunately for me, that was never one of my goals, because I've heard nightmare stories about marathon runners and, the type of fatigue and physical fatigue that it puts you through just on a marathon. So I can't even imagine a triathlon.
Yeah, I live in a triathlon town. So we have 2 to 3 of them in my town every year. And the area that I live in Ontario is just beautiful. It's all lakes, and we have multiple Ironmans per year. And what you see these people go through, because normally I usually volunteer with them, and for whatever reason, I always seem to end up on the run portion of the course. And by that point, they've already swam, they've already biked, and now they're just, running on fumes, figuratively and, real. And it is mind-boggling, really, what they go through. And the fact that people are even able to do it is quite fascinating to watch.
Well, let's segue then now, because that has a lot to do with the self. So, the way to detach from that, or the way to segue from that, is to maintain a spiritual condition. So tell us, Warren, how do you maintain your spiritual condition, that conscious contact with a higher power?
Well, that's a great question, and I was so happy that this was going to be part of what we talked about, because I am a firm believer in spirituality. I believe during active addiction, we are all robbed of our spirituality because it's just a lifestyle that doesn't really allow for spirituality. Spirituality for me on a daily basis is really a combination of things. Meditation is a huge part of my life, and it really is, I would say, the key component to recovery for me. So I do formal and informal meditations basically on a daily basis. So sometimes that's as short as a 5 or a 10-minute breathing exercise, which just is a grounding process for me, getting out of my head and just sort of connecting to my body and to my surroundings. But I'm also a voracious reader. So even all the way back to my short stint in formal university, coming out of high school, my BA was in philosophy and religion. So I've always found it fascinating to read about spiritual practices, and not just in one realm, in every realm possible. I love reading about how people have worked faith in history and in their lives. So I'm often kind of jumping around between reading Buddhist practices, reading Hindu practices, Christian, different years. I'm more focused into different things. And really the truth of it all to me is sort of what Joseph Campbell used to say is there's the one story and the one story only. And this is when you start reading multiple texts and really delving into it, you realize like the message is almost the same, just with slightly different undertones all throughout history and all throughout our spiritual texts. So this combination of the physical and being the running, I almost find spiritual at times. Then the meditative practices that are a big part of recovery for me, of understanding the difference between me and my mind, and then the reading side of things. So I'm never far away from some kind of connection to what spirituality is for me.
That's so important. It's beautiful. And I think the more people can identify and maybe apply a spiritual practice like what you're describing here, Warren, because it's like what I like to describe recovery as. I like to wear recovery like a loose garment. So religion and the thought of being rigid and the only one, it pushes people away, especially people like me. I'm just like right now in the process. It took me 5 years to get to this book, but I just started reading The Spirituality of Imperfection. And, that in of itself discusses these same principles where it's like, if you're in a recovery room, if you're in a room full of alcoholics or addicts, and you've got 6 different types of religious beliefs all under one roof discussing the concept of spirituality, void of the religious aspect of it, it ignites something very different. It's a lot more cohesive. I'm real big on connecting to that higher power in whatever way you choose it to be, because most religions, like you say, are all based on the same sort of spiritual principles.
They really are. And it's just the dogma that separates us. And, in religions, that when individuals get too highly connected to the dogmatic side of their faith, that's where they begin to feel this separation. And one of the reasons why I tend to lean more towards the Eastern faiths and writing is that it doesn't matter really what kind of dogma you want to follow. The spiritual principles reside kind of above it all. And that is what I find one of the most beautiful things about the sort of the human condition, is that we all, when you get down to the core messages of love and respect and knowing yourself and treating others in a respectable way, then we're all the same.
Absolutely. And it's funny that we start having these types of conversations. And, we're in the middle of this podcast right now because we're talking about recovery. But there was that part of our lives where we were just raging alcoholics and drug addicts, wreaking havoc, completely disconnected from a higher power, completely disconnected from the rest of society at some point. We want to get into feeling a part of, but, once the drugs and alcohol take over, then it pulls you away again and it isolates you, which allows me to segue into the next question, because we go from talking about spirituality and maintaining a spiritual condition to talking about that first time you drank or used drugs, and more importantly, how that made you feel.
I was quite young. It was grade 7 for me. So that would have been, I was about 12, 13 years old. And I had suffered, many years of anxiety and depression right back to about age 8. So when I first got high, it was the biggest relief I had ever kind of experienced to that point. I was one of those, I wouldn't say this happens maybe 50% of the time, but I was addicted the first try. Mm-hmm. It was such a relief for me at that point, after so many years of being challenged with depression and anxiety, that this was the greatest thing I had I had ever found at that point. And essentially, by the time I had reached grade 9, I was using daily. So the only thing that really stopped me in grade 7 and 8 was just accessibility. And the one thing that I was never a drug of choice for me, which I probably would have had a higher level of accessibility around, was alcohol, because my mother was an alcoholic. So the horrible things that I had witnessed with her really kind of turned me off alcohol as a drug of choice. I partied with alcohol many times, but it was not my drug of choice. Marijuana was my drug of choice. And, a lot of people, there's a lot of debate around how detrimental it can be. But when you see it as your primary for managing life, it's certainly problematic. And by the time I had reached grade 9, I was at daily use, and I was always uncomfortable with the idea of ever running out.
Yeah, I get it. Warren, you're absolutely warmed up, buddy. I love it. So it's time for me to turn this show over to you. It's time for you to share your story, the battle against drugs and alcohol, the wreckage it caused in your life, when you hit rock bottom, and finally your journey into recovery up until today. So Warren, take it away.
Okay. You might need to redirect me along the way, but
don't worry, I'll pull you in.
So to, expand a little bit on the last question, at age 8, there was a suicide in my family. I lost my brother to suicide, and I was 8 years old when it happened, wow, which really sent me into many years of high-level depression. Anxiety was something that sort of came and went, especially in those younger years. Well, I was introduced to marijuana in grade 7. And like I said in the previous question, it was, and it relates a little bit to the spirituality that we were talking about as well. It allowed me, my faith actually went into pot. And I believed deeply that this was my salvation.
Yeah, I get it.
That this is where it was. And because of some of society's lackadaisical approach to marijuana, there was a lot of validation that I was able to put into marijuana as well. I'm not a cocaine user, and I'm not a heroin addict, and it's really just kind of glorified smoking. Right. Talk about justification and the way that we validate these things. I was constantly, the real dark side of it was that because you can't go to the corner store and pick up marijuana, I was always worried about it running out.
Right.
And that as my desire and as my tolerance went up, I was using more and more to, some pretty high levels, especially with the impact that it had on my breathing and on my lungs. And I was constantly kind of fighting colds and flus because my immune system was sort of always being hit by, fighting off the carcinogens and all the things in marijuana. And for many years, it made me a very selfish person, that, I was consistently just absorbed by how much did I have, how much was available in the future. Did I need to, get in touch with my dealer, and always trying to push the limits as well. So marijuana was kind of my mainstay, but I was heavily into hallucinogenics as well, especially during, high school and university. So a lot of LSD, a lot of, mushrooms and things of that kind, where whether it was Friday or Saturday night, you just would sort of tie it on even more. And I was always sort of seeking higher levels of experience. So, trying to kind of push the limits on how far could I go with this. And there was a little bit of I don't know if death wish is the best word for it, but, how far could I push the limits, and how far could I push my own capacity for consuming these things? It definitely wreaked a lot of havoc. There was a lot of, especially in my family, there was a lot of secrecy. Obviously, I couldn't come out to, my parents in any way about what was going on. They knew I liked it to have fun, but they really, had no idea that this was something I couldn't really go a day without, or if I had to go a day without, that I was immediately plunged into really deep levels of depression and anxiety. That was one of the things that, when I wasn't sedated, as soon as that started to wear off, there was big issues with anxiety, with depression. And one of the things that I kind of learned clinically later on is that, marijuana is a good tool in certain ways, but it is a depressant. So as it would wear off. The depressant side of marijuana would start to kind of hit me more. So I wasn't even really dealing with just my own depression. I was also dealing with the depression that marijuana itself was creating. So there was a double whammy where, during the euphoric side of the high, I felt better. But as I would come down, I would feel higher levels of depression. And I really didn't know, because I was afraid of going any length of time without the drug, that I didn't have any real grasp of how significant these things were. How much of it was pot, how much of it was partying, how much of it was truly what I was dealing with. So things got darker because, as life went on and it became less socially acceptable to be partying all the time, I was doing things more and more behind closed doors.
Right.
And so once I got out of university and started working, I was hiding. I was getting high in my car, and I was doing it before work and on lunch breaks and, things like that. And now it was really not socially acceptable. And I was having to hide a lot. So there was this alter, which, I know all addicts generally deal with, is you're living two lives. And there's a real depression and a real shame process, obviously shame and guilt process in that as I got older, I realized, the bulk of the population is not living the way I live.
That's true.
Yeah.
But we think they are.
Well, or we try to surround ourselves as much as possible with people that are doing the same thing. But I didn't really like hanging out with all the time with the people that were like hardcore partying. So I had a real challenge with duality in that I had aspirations. I had aspirations for, and not that all addicts don't, but I had some pretty high level aspirations for, wanting to be functional, wanting to be part of mainstream sort of society, but had this background issue and problem, which caused a lot of shame and caused a lot of guilt. So, and then when my relationship with my now wife began to flourish, there was a duality in that I wasn't always comfortable. I mean, she knew that I smoked, but she didn't necessarily know the degree. And I would hide things just for the sake of not wanting to have the conversation, or really it was often more my own shame and my own guilt than anything that she really even felt, because I didn't want to be living the life I was living. And that caused a lot of issues and a lot of secrecy. So things got darker and darker as the years went on, in that I would say the higher self in me was really screaming for relief and wanted to change things. Obviously, I lost my brother's suicide. He was an alcoholic, and I watched my mother. I watched, multiple family members kind of go through these really horrible things, and I didn't want to go there. But the mental state really perpetuated continuing to get high. And that was just, for any addict, I know it's just absolutely a terrible, terrible place to be, between what you want and what you feel you're capable of, and this, repetition that mind goes through on a daily basis of winning and losing. So things really got into some of the darkest stages. Bottom for me was not really a single event. It was multiple events. Generally, they were all around getting caught. So whether work started to have inklings that I wasn't always all there, and also, getting caught with my wife. One of the worst bottoms I ever had was going to a social function. I left the social function, found a parking lot, and, was smoking a joint, hiding behind a car. and just to really, I had been gone long enough that my wife's radar went up, and she wanted to find me, and she found me, getting high behind a car. And that was one of those really brutal lows where I couldn't shake off the shame and the guilt of this was a social function where it was a mainstream social function. It wasn't, drugs weren't cool there.
Right.
And, here I was, having to leave just to kind of top up my buzz. And that was one of those really, really dark moments. And it was a culmination of a couple of those where I finally went into formal treatment, into a 28-day program, and had a good long stretch of clean time after that. I got close to a year after that first true formal kind of approach, and then had many years of on and off, success, failure, and more of these moments of getting caught or, shame or guilt or getting caught in some kind of lie or something like that. And ultimately my marriage was falling apart. The trust was eroding. And we had one of those conversations, one of those deep conversations, those aha moments of,
right.
I had this really deep understanding in one of those conversations that I was about to lose really the one thing that was most important to me was, obviously my marriage. And that was when I had to get really serious with, okay, I need to work the principles that I had learned in mainstream recovery. But I also had to, and that's when I began working with an addiction coach who some of his work was mainstream and some of his work was not mainstream. And that was what truly got me into the long stretch of recovery, that where other lights started to turn on that weren't just based in one methodology. Because I think, I'm a pretty analytical person and I don't like putting all my eggs in one basket.
Right.
For whatever reason. And when I started to work with this addiction coach who had multiple options available to me and was allowed me to create a recovery sort of model that worked for him and in turn worked for me, because it kind of, I believe, ultimately pulls from multiple sources and allowed me to create a kind of an approach that was uniquely beneficial to me. And also never ever letting go of the reality that if I was to go back into active addiction, that I was going to lose some very, very high level pieces of my life that I wasn't willing to lose.
Right.
That was really what I needed to maintain contact with, of why are we doing what we're doing? Because that was the big thing that led me back into active addiction multiple times, was losing connection to why recovery needed to be the ultimate priority, in my life.
Awesome. Warren, I love it. And if you wouldn't mind, because, we had a conversation earlier by email, and it was, I guess, more of the non-conventional way of working a recovery program. I grew up in the NA fellowship. I'm also part of the AA fellowship. But at the same time, there's some methods that you were discussing right now as far as your recovery coach gave you some non-mainstream ways of finding recovery that you connected with. What are a few of those things that you can share with us that really brought the idea of becoming or being able to recover?
Yeah. So I would say the bulk of them fall into what we're now calling mindfulness-based practices. So what I had to realize in my recovery is that one of the driving factors, the key driving factor to me in addiction was depression. And depression came from a lot of internal dialogue. It came from a lot of these things that my mind would tell me about myself, about life, about others that were very depressing.
Right.
And I had this consistent struggle between what my mind believed and would say. And I was constantly challenged by my own internal dialogue. Mindfulness and meditative practices, getting into those methods, is what really allowed me to understand that I'm not just my brain. I'm not just my thoughts. And so as I started to work with meditative practices, as I started to work with cognitive behavioral work, starting to write things down and really get into questioning my own thinking, my mind's thinking, because one of the greatest realizations that I ever had in recovery was actually after reading Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. That's how I really began to understand that I wasn't just my thoughts. And as I paid more and more attention to that through meditative practices and through mindfulness techniques, I started to get more and more freedom from the addictive impulse, from, the part of my mind that just wanted to get high and wanted to escape. And that there were methods of, managing that weren't just based on getting another day clean. Because for me, focusing on, every minute clean and every day clean, for me, perpetuated the struggle. And, I didn't want to struggle. I didn't really nobody wants to struggle. And I didn't want my life to be a process of counting every day clean. And when I started to work mindfulness practices and approaches along with, because, that 28-day program that I went through in the very beginning,
right?
It was 12-step. And thank God for NA, because it was a massive part of my recovery. But as a method all by itself, I needed a little more. And that was what mindfulness and meditation and a lot of Eastern practices gave to me, of this additional approach and side of things that allowed me to move into what spoke to me a little bit more on the spiritual. I tend to lean more towards Eastern practices than Western practices. And that was a massive relief when I started to really get that side of things and realize that one of the quotes that came from my coach was, Warren, you have to be as persistent as your mind. And when I started to realize that I had to start to write a new way of thinking and think new things and shut down the depressive thoughts and shut down the anxiety and start to really focus on the other faiths and the other ways of looking at things, that's when true recovery really started to move its way into my life. And this compulsion started to just drop off of, okay, I say this to all my clients, Friday afternoon is still Friday afternoon for me. Being, mine shows up and it says, hey, it's Friday afternoon. It's one of it's one of my most deeply embedded neural pathways.
Yeah.
Is, all those years in high school and university, that's when it was socially acceptable. Is Friday afternoon. That's when everybody wanted to tie one on. And that was when, I didn't have to feel any shame at all.
Absolutely.
Because that's what it is. And Friday afternoon will always be Friday afternoon for me. What has changed is now that's just a neural process for me. It's not anything that has any real strength. There's nothing in my life that I feel I have to escape from anymore. And if I feel I have to escape from something or I have to manage something, I do that through mindfulness techniques, and I do that through working my program on multiple levels.
That's wonderful. And real quick, I want to go back a little bit. You're talking about your brother's suicide and also that he was an alcoholic. So I'm assuming he was older than you.
Much older, yes.
Okay. How old was he and how old were you at that time?
I was 8 and he was 21.
Oh, wow. That's a huge age gap.
Yeah.
And also, yeah, being 8 years old and having to process those feelings and emotions that are still so early on. And how do you even process that? And so he was 21. You started around 13 smoking. Yeah. And how long did that progress? How many years did you go on using before you finally tapped out?
It was, because of those years of sort of being on and off, I went into that formal treatment program when I was 23, and, sort of true recovery began about 29.
Would you say it was a 10-year run, or would you say it was longer?
I would say it was longer because often, a lot of those times when I would go back in.
Okay, it wasn't a stint. Like you found recovery at 23, but then you actually completely stopped at 29.
Yeah.
Okay, I got you. Oh man, so we're talking 15 years, something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a long run. All right, so I'll tell you what, Warren, first of all, let's answer some questions for the newcomer. I'm going to ask you 5 questions about your early recovery. I want you to respond with inspiring and insightful answers you can share with our newcomers. Are you ready, Warren?
I am.
Okay, great. All right, number 1, what was keeping you from getting clean or staying clean when you first got introduced to recovery?
Internal dialogue. What I really think it was is not managing the internal dialogue and not being able to really understand why I was thinking the way I was thinking and the actual therapy necessary to change that.
Absolutely perfect. That's beautiful, man. So next question. At what point did you have a spiritual awakening, that aha moment in recovery when you accepted that you were powerless over drugs and alcohol, but for the first time had developed that hope that you could recover?
So the aha moment was what I mentioned with reading The Power of Now. The Power of Now, there was actually an actual moment of total clarity that, for whatever reason, through that book, I was able to see that somebody else got it, that there was this part of our brain that was constantly trying to sort of sabotage us. So that was my moment of, holy cow, I believe now recovery is possible because I'm not alone anymore in this process. The rooms did a very good job of me feeling not alone, but just more on a sort of psychological level, that book was a massive breakthrough for me. On the powerless side of things, my take on powerlessness is that when my addiction is active, I'm completely powerless. I fully understand that, and I fully believe that you put a bag of pot in front of me and I'm not going to be the one saying no. But on the other side of it is that I believe actually that my power increases almost every day in recovery. And that was an important little sort of tweak for me to make in my own process, was that I'm gaining strength on many levels every day that I stay clean.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. As a matter of fact, the reason why I ask these questions is focused towards the newcomer. I want the newcomer to hear what we were going through in the beginning. Our opening conversation was about running marathons, spirituality, how we connected. It's a completely different conversation than when you've got 30 days and you're trying to figure out how to go one day at a time without, if somebody sticks a bag of pot in front of your face, what do I do? And so there was that, even though I recognize that I'm powerless at some point over drugs and alcohol, against that first drug or against that first alcohol, that all of a sudden, like you, I discovered, wait a minute, I now have these tools that I can use to become powerful. This can help me moving forward. And so again, it's a lot more about not where we're at today. Like you or like me, I don't think about it. There's not moments in my day, or like you said, like Friday comes, right? I get that same feeling of it's Friday, but it's almost like it's just like, wow, I can like let go a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm a different person on Monday than I am on Friday. That period. No question about that, right? But that thought about using drugs, that doesn't pop into my head, or the struggle with it. After all these years of working a program and discovering all these tools like you and I have, it becomes a lot easier. So again, this was more tailored towards the newcomer. And my next question for you is going to be, what book you would recommend to a newcomer that you read in early recovery. I don't know if it's Eckhart Tolle or if there was another one.
It would be The Power of Now. The second one, I would say it's a different style of writing, but I love The Way of the Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman. It is just a beautiful, beautiful read about an individual. His issue wasn't with drugs, but his issue was definitely with his mind. And really, there's no major difference there. And his story of how he worked through his own internal processes, his own shame and guilt and frustration and anger and things of that kind. Just a beautiful story that I've read many, many times actually over the years in recovery that always makes me feel just really fulfilled. He has a beautiful way of writing.
Wonderful. That's going to be listed in the show notes, folks. And what is the best suggestion you have ever received?
The best suggestion I've ever received is there's a 12-step phrase for it of, I'm going to butcher this, but it works if you work it, so work it, you're worth it. And that whole phrase of, see, one of the things that I've found, and I certainly was challenged with this, is that I'm different. I'm the exception to the rule. These things may work for everybody else, but they don't work for me. And I really had to overcome that part of ego. And that phrase in 12-step recovery of, it works if you work it, so work it, you're worth it. And if I stick to a process and I'm vigilant with that process, I'm not the exception to the rule. It's going to work because it's worked for so many. And why would I let ego actually have me believe that I'm the exception to this rule? I'm the different one. That's so important in recovery is, work the processes, work the program, work whatever you're doing. Consistently, results will come.
Beautiful. I love it, man. And it's so powerful. It does work if you work it.
Yeah.
And work it because you're worth it. I mean, bottom line is you're worth the effort. And if you can just take the time to follow these suggestions, your life will change immeasurably. So now moving forward, that was the best suggestion you received. If you could give a newcomer only one suggestion, what would that be?
Have faith. For whatever amount of time it takes. Obviously my process during the on and off years was a long one. But the one thing that did stick in there was I had a faith that at some point I was going to get it. I might need to find more tools, and we all need to find the tools that ultimately work best for us. But as long as the faith component is there, it'll happen.
Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful suggestion, Warren. Now, Warren, before we say goodbye, I want you to tell us a little bit about your program, what you do as a coach, what you offer your clients and other people seeking recovery.
Yeah. So as an addictions coach, what I do primarily with my clients that isn't really an option within 12-step meetings is that we all do have individual issues. We all do have individual internal dialogue that needs to be worked through. So my process with my clients is to teach them some of these things that we talked about in the interview of mindfulness techniques and meditative techniques, cognitive work to add to their toolbox, because I really, really believe that the more tools in the toolbox, the better. So one day you may need to rely more on 12-step teaching. The next day you may need to rely more on meditative principles. The work that I do with my clients is to get into their story. We all have a story and we need to work through it. And that whatever drove us into addiction or kept us there is a story in the mind. And there's a way to reframe that over time with working with a proper coach or a therapist that can allow you some freedom out of your own story, which makes a massive difference in managing recovery. That'd be sort of the short explanation of a lot of the work that I end up doing.
Absolutely beautiful. I love it. So what is the best way for our listeners to get a hold of you, Warren?
Would just be through my website, which is warrenbroad.com.
All right. And folks, that again will be in the show notes. Fabulous. Okay, we have now reached the end of our show. Thanks for joining us. And as we say here in Costa Rica, pura vida.
Pura vida.
Thank you for joining us on the Share Recovery Podcast. To check out the show notes page on this interview or to thank our guests for sharing their story, go to www.thesharepodcast.com. While you're on the website, don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter to stay up to date on the latest news, podcasts, and interviews. Want to be one of our guests and share your story? Then go to our website and click on the Share Your Story button. We share our inspiring recovery stories every Tuesday, so subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher Radio to get your free weekly download. We'll see you then. The opinions shared on this show reflect those of the individual speaker and not of any 12-Step Fellowship as a whole. And though we discuss 12-Step recovery and the impact it had in our lives, we do not promote or endorse any 12-Step Anonymous program.